told you that on a quiet September evening in 1952, a group of ordinary people in a small West Virginia town came face to face with something so terrifying, so utterly impossible, that it would haunt them for the rest of their lives? What if I told you that this wasn't just another UFO story or a case of mistaken identity, but an encounter so visceral, so physically documented, that even the United States military allegedly got involved and then tried to bury the evidence? What if I told you that witnesses didn't just see something strange in the sky, but came within feet of a 10-foot-tall entity with glowing red eyes that could shoot beams of light, a creature that hovered above the ground, emitted toxic green mist, and left multiple people violently ill? And what if I told you that this same entity might have been connected to the mysterious disappearance of a military aircraft and its crew, a disappearance so thoroughly scrubbed from official records that it's as if the plane and the two men aboard never existed at all? This is not science fiction. This is not folklore passed down through generations until the truth became distorted beyond recognition. This is a documented incident with multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence collected by National Guard officers, and a timeline of events so bizarre and specific that it defies conventional explanation. This is the story of the Flatwoods Monster, one of America's most terrifying and unexplained encounters. And by the time you finish hearing what really happened that night, you'll understand why the people of Flatwoods, West Virginia, still speak about it in hushed tones, and why the truth, whatever it may be, continues to elude us more than 70 years later. America is a land of mysteries. From the fog-shrouded coastlines of the Pacific Northwest to the dense swamplands of the Deep South, from the windswept plains of the Midwest to the ancient mountains of Appalachia, this country has always been a breeding ground for the unexplained. There's something about the vastness of the American landscape, the sheer endless stretches of wilderness that remain untouched by human hands, that seems to invite the strange and the impossible. Every state has its stories. Every region has its legends. And if you dig deep enough into the history and folklore of any particular place in this country, you'll find tales that challenge everything we think we know about reality. Take South Carolina, for instance. In the swamps around Scapor, there have been numerous sightings of what locals call the Lizard Man, a 7-foot-tall reptilian creature with green scaly skin and glowing red eyes that has allegedly attacked cars and terrified residents since the late 1980s. Or consider Iowa, where the small town of Van Meter was plagued in 1903 by a bizarre winged creature with a horn-like projection on its head that emitted a blinding light. Witnesses included the town's doctor, a bank cashier, and a hardware store owner, all upstanding citizens with no reason to fabricate such an outlandish story. Then there's the Dover Demon of Massachusetts, a pale, hairless creature with orange eyes and elongated limbs spotted by multiple teenagers over the course of 2 days in 1977. And we can't forget the Enfield Horror of Illinois, the Honey Island Swamp Monster of Louisiana, or the terrifying Dogman sightings that have emerged from the forests of Michigan. But perhaps no state has a richer tradition of cryptid encounters than West Virginia. This is a place where the mountains are old, older than almost any other mountain range on Earth, where the forests are thick and dark and seem to hold secrets that predate human civilization itself. West Virginia is a state where the veil between the known and the unknown feels particularly thin, where the impossible doesn't just seem possible, it seems inevitable. The most famous of West Virginia's mysterious residents is, of course, the Mothman, that winged humanoid entity with glowing red eyes that appeared in Point Pleasant in the late 1960s, terrorizing the town and seemingly predicting the catastrophic collapse of the Silver Bridge that killed 46 people. The Mothman has become an international phenomenon, the subject of books, documentaries, and Hollywood films, a creature that has transcended local legend to become a global icon of the paranormal. But here's what most people don't know. The Mothman isn't West Virginia's only claim to fame in the world of the unexplained. In fact, the Mothman isn't even the state's first widely documented encounter with something otherworldly. 15 years before the Mothman appeared in Point Pleasant, something equally bizarre, equally terrifying, and arguably even more physically documented, occurred just 25 miles to the east in a small, unassuming town called Flatwoods. What happened there on the night of September 12, 1952, would become one of the most compelling and disturbing encounters in American history. An incident that involved not just one or two witnesses, but an entire group of people, including children, a respected mother, and a National Guard member. It was an encounter that left physical evidence, caused genuine medical symptoms, attracted the attention of national media, and allegedly prompted a military response and subsequent cover-up. This is the story that predates the Mothman. This is the story that set the stage for West Virginia's reputation as a hotbed of high strangeness. This is the story of the Flatwoods Monster. To understand what happened in Flatwoods, we need to understand the time and place. It's 1952, and America is in the grip of what historians would later call the second great wave of UFO sightings. The modern UFO era had begun just 5 years earlier in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of 9 unusual aircraft near Mount Rainier, Washington, the incident that gave birth to the term flying saucer. Since then, reports of strange objects in the sky had multiplied exponentially. The Air Force had launched Project Blue Book to investigate these sightings, and the country was simultaneously fascinated and terrified by the possibility of visitors from other worlds. But there was another layer to this fear. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had recently tested its first atomic bomb, the Korean War was raging, and the specter of communist invasion haunted the American psyche. When people saw strange lights in the sky, they didn't know if they were looking at alien spacecraft or Soviet aircraft. The line between science fiction and geopolitical nightmare had become dangerously blurred. Flatwoods itself was, and still is, a quintessential small American town. Located in Braxton County in central West Virginia, it's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where life moves at a slower pace, where children can play outside until dark without their parents worrying too much, and where the biggest source of excitement is usually the Friday night high school football game. The population in 1952 was barely 300 people. The landscape is dominated by rolling hills covered in dense hardwood forests, the kind of terrain that defines Appalachia. Beautiful, isolated, and just a little bit mysterious even in broad daylight. As evening approached on September 12, 1952, the town was winding down from another ordinary day. Parents were preparing dinner. Children were squeezing in the last few minutes of outdoor play before being called inside. The sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. That brief magical window of dusk when the world exists in a liminal space between day and night. 2 brothers, Edward and Fred May, were outside playing near their home with their friend, a boy named Tommy Heyer. Edward was 13, Fred was 12, and Tommy was 10. They were doing what boys that age have always done, running around, probably playing some variation of tag or soldiers or whatever game had captured their imagination that particular evening. They were in that perfect state of childhood, where time seems infinite and the ordinary world is already filled with enough adventure to satisfy any young imagination. And then, without warning, the ordinary became extraordinary. The 3 boys simultaneously caught sight of something in the sky above them, something that made them stop dead in their tracks and stare upward with a mixture of excitement and confusion. At first, it looked like a meteor, a brilliant red fireball streaking across the darkening sky, the kind of celestial display that any young boy would find thrilling. But as they watched, pointing and shouting to each other, they began to realize that something was wrong with this particular meteor. It wasn't behaving the way meteors are supposed to behave. Meteors fall. They plummet toward the Earth at incredible speeds, burning up in the atmosphere, creating a brief spectacular display before winking out of existence or occasionally striking the ground with tremendous force. But this object, this red glowing sphere, wasn't falling in the way meteors fall. Instead, it seemed to be slowing down. It was decelerating. It was moving across the sky with what appeared to be deliberate, controlled motion, as if it was being piloted, as if something or someone was guiding its descent. The boys watched, transfixed, as the object continued its strange journey downward, passing over the treetops and disappearing from sight somewhere in the nearby woods in the direction of the farm that belonged to a local man named G. Bailey Fisher. The object had descended into the forest on a hill that overlooked Fisher's property, close enough that the boys could roughly estimate where it had come down, but far enough that they couldn't see what had happened after it disappeared behind the trees. For a moment, the three boys just stood there, looking at each other, their minds racing. They had just witnessed something impossible. This wasn't a meteor. This wasn't an airplane. This was something else entirely, something that defied their limited understanding of how the world worked. And like all young boys faced with an irresistible mystery, they immediately wanted to investigate, but they also knew they couldn't go alone. Whatever that thing was, wherever it had landed, venturing into the darkening woods to find it was not something three young boys should attempt by themselves. They needed adult supervision. They needed someone who would believe them and be willing to go look. Without another word, the three of them took off running toward the May family home, their hearts pounding with excitement and just the first tingling edge of fear. When Edward and Fred burst through the door of their home, breathless and talking over each other, their mother Kathleen May was understandably skeptical. Kathleen was a practical woman, a beautician by trade, someone accustomed to dealing with reality in its most mundane forms: hair, gossip, small-town life. She had raised her sons to be honest, but she also knew that children have active imaginations, and three excited boys who had been playing outside at dusk could easily convince each other that they had seen something extraordinary when in fact it was probably just an airplane or a particularly bright star or some other perfectly ordinary phenomenon. But as she looked at her sons and their friend, as she heard the urgency in their voices and saw the genuine confusion and concern in their eyes, she began to wonder if perhaps they really had seen something unusual. The boys weren't acting like they were making something up or playing a prank. They weren't giggling or exchanging knowing looks. They were genuinely agitated, talking rapidly about this red glowing object that had descended into the woods in a controlled manner, that had definitely landed somewhere on or near the Fisher farm. Tommy Hyer, normally a quiet boy, was just as insistent as her own sons. They weren't asking her to believe in little green men or flying saucers, not exactly. They were simply asking her to come with them and look at whatever had landed in the woods. It was a reasonable request in its way. If something had crashed or landed, if there was any kind of aircraft in distress, it would be the responsible thing to check on it, to see if anyone needed help, to report it to the authorities if necessary. Kathleen's maternal instincts were torn between protecting her sons from what might be a wild goose chase or something potentially dangerous, and recognizing that if they really had witnessed something unusual, ignoring it wouldn't be the right response either. She made a compromise with herself. She would go with them, but they would take precautions. First, they would bring the family dog, a large and loyal animal that would alert them to any danger and provide some measure of protection. Second, she would ask Eugene Lemon to accompany them. Eugene was 17 years old, not quite an adult, but close enough. And more importantly, he was a member of the National Guard. He had some training, some experience with emergency situations, and his presence would provide an additional layer of safety and credibility. If they were going to go tramping through the woods at dusk looking for some mysterious object, they were going to do it as safely and responsibly as possible. Kathleen made a quick phone call to Eugene, explaining the situation. To her relief, he didn't dismiss the story out of hand. In fact, he seemed intrigued. The year 1952 had been full of UFO reports across the country, and like many young men of his generation, Eugene found the idea of investigating a potential flying saucer landing to be an irresistible adventure. He told Kathleen he would be right over, and he was good to his word. Within minutes, Eugene arrived at the May household, accompanied by two of his own friends, both around his age. The group now consisted of 7 people: Kathleen May, her 2 sons Edward and Fred, their friend Tommy Hyer, Eugene Lemon, and Eugene's 2 friends, plus the dog. It was a sizable enough group that they could look out for each other, but small enough to move through the woods without too much difficulty. As the sun continued to set and the shadows grew longer, the group set out on foot, heading toward the Fisher farm and the wooded hill where the boys insisted they had seen the object descend. Kathleen had grabbed a flashlight, and Eugene had one as well. The family dog trotted alongside them, alert and curious, but not yet showing any signs of distress. The walk to the site took several minutes, and as they moved away from the houses and street lights of the small town and into the increasingly dark embrace of the forest, the mood began to shift. What had started as an adventure, almost a lark, was beginning to feel more serious. The woods at dusk have a way of changing people's perceptions. Familiar landscapes become alien. Every snapping twig sounds amplified. Every shadow could be hiding something. The group moved more cautiously now, staying close together, their voices dropping to near whispers, even though there was no logical reason to be quiet. The terrain began to slope upward as they entered the tree line, and the group found themselves climbing a modest hill, their path illuminated by the narrow beams of their flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The air smelled of earth and vegetation, the normal sense of a West Virginia forest in early autumn. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the patches of sky, visible through the canopy of leaves. It was the kind of peaceful evening that should have been utterly ordinary, the kind of evening that people in small towns take for granted, that becomes a pleasant memory of childhood or a moment of quiet reflection in adulthood. But as the group crested a small rise and looked down into a cleared area at the base of the hill, they realized that this evening was going to be anything but ordinary. There it was, the object. It was real. The boys hadn't been imagining things or making up stories. There was actually something there, something that had no business being in the woods of Flatwoods, West Virginia. The object was difficult to describe with precision because the light was fading and because it was partially obscured by trees and the terrain, but certain features were undeniable. It appeared to be roughly egg-shaped or spherical, though some witnesses would later say it was more elongated. What was absolutely certain was that it was radiating light, a dull, pulsing crimson glow that emanated from somewhere deep within its structure, casting an eerie red illumination across the immediate area. The light wasn't steady. It pulsed with a slow, almost organic rhythm, like a heartbeat, brightening and dimming in a regular pattern that was deeply unsettling to watch. But it wasn't just the light that was disturbing. The object was also emitting something else. A thick, greenish vapor or mist that seemed to cling to the ground around it, spreading outward in lazy tendrils, hovering just above the grass and weeds, rather than dissipating into the air the way normal fog or steam would. The mist had a strange, almost oily quality to it, and it seemed to be being actively produced by the craft rather than being a byproduct of its landing. As the group stood there, frozen in a mixture of awe and growing apprehension, trying to process what they were seeing, the family dog suddenly reacted. Without warning, the animal let out a sharp, aggressive bark and then lunged forward, jerking its leash out of the hands of whoever was holding it and racing down the hill toward the object. Perhaps the dog perceived the object as a threat to its family. Perhaps its animal instincts were reacting to something that the humans couldn't consciously perceive. Or perhaps it was simply curious in the way that dogs are, compelled to investigate this strange new thing in its territory. Whatever the reason, the dog's sprint toward the craft lasted only a few seconds before its aggressive posture changed dramatically. As soon as the animal reached the edge of that green mist, as soon as it entered the cloud of vapor surrounding the object, its behavior transformed completely. The barking stopped. The aggressive charge halted. The dog let out a yelp of distress, a sound of pain or terror or both, and then immediately turned and began running back up the hill, past the stunned group of witnesses, racing back toward town as fast as its legs could carry it. It didn't stop. It didn't look back. It simply ran, fleeing from whatever it had encountered in that mist with a blind panic that was absolutely primal. The dog's reaction sent a wave of cold fear through the group. Animals know things that humans don't. They can sense danger in ways that our civilized, rational minds have forgotten. And if the dog, a large and normally brave animal, was that terrified of whatever was down there, maybe the humans should be terrified too. But before anyone could suggest that they turn around and follow the dog back to safety, before anyone could voice the growing sense that they had made a terrible mistake in coming here, something else happened that would push the encounter from merely strange into the realm of absolute nightmare. The hissing sound started softly at first, barely audible over the pounding of hearts and the nervous breathing of the witnesses. But it grew louder, more insistent, a sharp, sustained, sibilant sound that seemed to be coming from above them rather than from the direction of the landed craft. It was a mechanical sound, not quite like steam escaping from a pipe, but not entirely unlike it either. It had an artificial quality, something produced rather than natural, and it was coming from somewhere in the tree canopy above their heads. Eugene Lemon, acting on instinct, raised his flashlight and directed the beam upward into the branches, sweeping it across the foliage in an attempt to locate the source of the sound. And that's when the beam of his flashlight caught something that should not have been there, something that should not have existed, something that would burn itself into the memories of every person present for the rest of their lives. Suspended somehow in the tree, or possibly hovering just beside it, was a figure, a being. An entity that was so far removed from anything in the normal world that the human mind struggled to even process what it was seeing. The first thing that struck the witnesses was the size. This thing, whatever it was huge. Estimates would vary slightly in the retellings, but the consensus was that it stood somewhere between 10 and 12 feet tall, towering above the already considerable height of a normal human being. But it wasn't just tall. It was imposing in a way that went beyond mere physical dimensions. It radiated a sense of otherness, of wrongness, that made every primitive survival instinct in the human brain scream warnings of danger. The entity's body was shrouded in, or perhaps consisted of a dark greenish or sometimes described as almost black material that hung in folds, creating the impression of a cloak or robe. This garment, if that's what it was, extended upward to form a distinctive hood or collar that rose behind and around what served as the creature's head. Multiple witnesses would later describe this hood shape as resembling the ace of spades from a deck of cards, that distinctive pointed arch that frames the symbol. The hood created a dramatic silhouette, making the entity's head appear even larger and more imposing than it already was. And the head itself, the face of this thing, was unlike anything from Earth. It was described as bright red, glowing with its own internal illumination, shaped somewhat like an elongated oval, or perhaps more accurately like an ace of spades as well, mirroring the hood that framed it. But the most disturbing features were the eyes, if they were eyes. Where a human face would have eyes, this entity had what appeared to be two perfectly circular openings, or perhaps mechanical apertures, and from these openings projected beams of light, not reflected light like you might see from an animal's eyes caught in a flashlight beam, but actively projected illumination, as if the creature had built-in searchlights or laser emitters where its eyes should be. These beams were a yellowish or orange color, and they moved independently, scanning the area around the entity like the turret lights on a ship or the search beams on a robot. It was this detail more than any other that convinced several witnesses that what they were looking at was not biological, not a living creature in the conventional sense, but rather some kind of mechanical construct, a robot or automaton of advanced design. As Eugene's flashlight beam illuminated the entity fully, the creature seemed to become aware of the group's presence. The beams of light projecting from its eye ports, which had been directed upward at the sky, slowly began to move downward, sweeping across the trees, and then finally coming to rest directly on the group of terrified witnesses. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two species, human and whatever this was, regarded each other in mutual assessment. The entity made no aggressive move. It didn't speak. It didn't gesture. It simply hung there in the air or clung to the tree, its mechanical eyes fixed on the humans, studying them with what might have been curiosity or might have been something else entirely. And then the entity began to move. It didn't walk or climb. It descended through the air in a smooth, controlled, gliding motion, as if it was riding an invisible elevator or being lowered by unseen wires. As it moved, that terrible hissing sound intensified, and more of the greenish mist began to emanate from its body or from the folds of its dark cloak, joining the vapor that was already spreading across the ground from the landed craft. The entity's eye beams never left the group of humans, tracking them with mechanical precision as it drew closer, closer, descending from its position 10 feet up in the tree toward the ground, where the witnesses stood frozen in terror. The green mist reached them before the entity did, and as the acrid vapor enveloped the group, several people immediately began to feel ill. Their eyes started to burn, their throats constricted. A wave of nausea swept through them, and that's when Eugene Lemon, the trained National Guardsman who was supposed to be the brave protector of this expedition, broke completely. Eugene let out a cry of absolute terror, dropped his flashlight where he stood, and turned and ran. There was no thought of standing his ground, no consideration of protecting the others, no attempt at rational analysis of what he was seeing. Every fiber of his being was screaming at him to flee, to get as far away from this impossible thing as quickly as humanly possible, and he obeyed that instinct without question. His panic was immediately contagious. When the man who was supposed to be their protector, their voice of experience and authority, broke and ran, the fragile composure of the rest of the group shattered completely. Kathleen May grabbed her sons, screaming at everyone to run, and the entire group turned as one and fled back down the path they had come. Stumbling and crashing through the underbrush in the darkness, no longer caring about direction or obstacles, caring only about putting distance between themselves and the thing they had just encountered. The run back to town was a blur of terror and confusion. People fell and scrambled back to their feet. Branches whipped across faces. The darkness that had seemed merely inconvenient on the way up to the site now seemed actively malevolent, hiding threats behind every shadow. No one looked back. No one dared to check if the entity was following them. They simply ran until they burst out of the tree line and back into the relative safety of the town, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding, their minds still struggling to process the impossible thing they had just witnessed. When they finally reached the May household, they discovered that the family dog had beaten them there and was cowering in the corner of the house, shaking and refusing to come out, its eyes wide with residual terror. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. In fact, in some ways it was just beginning. As the adrenaline began to wear off and the immediate panic subsided, replaced by shocked numbness, the witnesses began to realize that something was seriously wrong with their physical health. Multiple members of the group were experiencing severe symptoms. Their throats were swollen and irritated, making it difficult to breathe. Their eyes were burning and watering uncontrollably. Several people, including both children and adults, began vomiting violently, their bodies rejecting whatever toxin they had been exposed to in that green mist. Kathleen May had a particularly severe reaction, her symptoms so alarming that there was genuine concern she might need to be hospitalized. The family dog, which had been the first to encounter the mist, was in equally bad shape. The animal continued to shake and whimper, refused to eat, and seemed to be suffering from some kind of respiratory distress. Whatever that green vapor was, it was clearly not just theatrical smoke or natural fog. It was something genuinely harmful, something toxic, something that had caused measurable physical injury to every living creature that had been exposed to it. The physical symptoms would persist for days in some cases, and several witnesses would continue to experience recurring health problems that they attributed to that night's exposure. As the witnesses sat in the May household, still trembling, still ill, trying to make sense of what had just happened to them, Kathleen made the decision to call the authorities. This wasn't something they could just ignore or try to explain away. They had all seen something extraordinary and terrifying. They were all suffering from mysterious physical symptoms, and whatever that object was, it was still out there in the woods as far as they knew. Maybe it was a downed aircraft of some kind, experimental military technology that had malfunctioned. Maybe it was something else. But either way, this was a matter for the police. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, Kathleen placed a call to the Braxton County Sheriff's Office, and the strange tale of what had happened in the woods near the Fisher farm entered official record. 2 officers from the local sheriff's department arrived at the May household within the hour, and their initial reaction to the story they heard was, to put it mildly, skeptical. Here was a group of people, including children, claiming that they had seen a glowing craft that had descended from the sky in a controlled manner, that was now sitting in the woods emitting toxic green mist. And I was being guarded or accompanied by a 10-foot-tall floating robot with glowing eyes that shot beams of light and wore a spade-shaped cloak. It sounded like something out of a pulp science fiction magazine. It sounded like the kind of story that a group of people might concoct as a hoax to get attention, or perhaps the kind of sheer delusion that could grip a group of suggestible individuals who had convinced each other that they had seen something extraordinary when in fact they had simply misidentified some mundane object or creature. But as the officers listened to the witnesses and observed their condition, their skepticism began to be tempered by genuine concern. These people were clearly terrified. They weren't acting like pranksters or attention seekers. Several of them were visibly ill, displaying symptoms that were consistent with exposure to some kind of chemical irritant or toxic substance. The children in particular were in a state of genuine trauma, and Kathleen May, a respected member of the community who had no history of making up stories or seeking publicity, was adamant about what they had seen. The dog's condition also couldn't be easily dismissed. Whatever these people had encountered in those woods, it had clearly been something out of the ordinary, something that had caused them real physical harm. The officers agreed to drive out to the Fisher farm and investigate the site. They asked Eugene Lemon if he would accompany them and point out the exact location, but Eugene, still shaken to his core by what he had experienced, flatly refused. He would not go back to those woods. Not that night. Not ever if he could help it. The officers would have to find the location based on the directions provided by the witnesses. Taking their flashlights and a considerable amount of professional skepticism, the two lawmen headed into the woods, following the path that the witnesses had described. Making their way up the hill to the clearing where the object had allegedly landed, they were gone for approximately half an hour. When they returned to the May household, their expressions were unreadable, but their report was disappointingly mundane. They had found the location. They had found the clearing. But they had not found any craft, any robot, any green mist, or anything else out of the ordinary. The area appeared completely normal. There was no evidence of anything having landed there, no scorch marks, no disturbed earth, no physical traces of any kind. Whatever had been there, if indeed anything had been there at all, was gone now. The officers took statements from all the witnesses, documenting their stories in official reports, but it was clear that they didn't know what to make of the situation. They filed their reports and left, leaving the witnesses to deal with their trauma and confusion on their own, but the story didn't end there. News of the incident spread through Flatwoods with the incredible speed that gossip achieves in small towns. By the next morning, everyone in Braxton County seemed to know that something strange had happened near the Fisher farm. And as the day progressed, the story spread beyond the county, beyond West Virginia, reaching local news outlets and then regional media and then, incredibly, national attention. The story of the Flatwoods Monster, as it was already being called, was simply too bizarre, too dramatic, and too perfectly timed to be ignored by a media establishment that was already fascinated by UFO reports and Cold War paranoia. Within days, newspaper reporters from across the country were descending on Flatwoods, all wanting to interview the witnesses, to photograph the site, to get every possible detail of this incredible encounter. The May family and Eugene Lemon found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, their frightening experience transformed into a media spectacle. The attention culminated in an appearance on a national television program called We the People, where Kathleen May and Eugene Lemon were interviewed about their encounter, their testimony broadcast to millions of Americans sitting in their living rooms across the country. The Flatwoods Monster had become a national phenomenon. As media coverage of the Flatwoods incident intensified, something remarkable began to happen. Other people who had previously remained silent about their own strange experiences in the area, began to come forward with their own stories. It became clear that the events of September 12th were not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of unusual activity that had been occurring in the region for weeks or even months before the famous encounter. These additional testimonies added layers of credibility and complexity to the story, suggesting that whatever had visited Flatwoods that night might have been present in the area for a longer period than anyone had initially realized. One of the most compelling corroborating accounts came from a young woman named Audra Harper. Several weeks before the Flatwoods incident, Audra and her friend had been walking through a wooded area near the town of Heaters, located not far from Flatwoods, taking a shortcut home as the sun was setting. They were laughing and talking, enjoying the pleasant weather, when suddenly the forest around them was bathed in an eerie red glow. The girls stopped in their tracks, confused and frightened by this sudden and inexplicable illumination. Looking around for the source, they spotted a large, glowing red orb that appeared to have landed on top of a nearby hillside, pulsing with that same crimson light that the May group would later describe. But the orb wasn't the only thing they encountered. As the two girls stood there, frozen by fear and fascination, they heard movement behind them in the underbrush. Turning slowly, dreading what they might see, they were confronted with the sight of an impossibly tall, thin figure emerging from the tree line. Even in the dim light, they could tell that this was no normal person, no animal, no anything that should exist in the rational world. The figure's proportions were all wrong, its movements too smooth, its presence too utterly alien. The girls didn't wait to see more. They ran, crashing through the woods in blind panic, not stopping until they reached their homes. When they breathlessly told their parents what they had seen, they were scolded for being in the woods after dark and told to stop making up stories. The incident was dismissed as overactive imagination, and the girls, embarrassed and unconvinced that anyone would believe them, never spoke of it publicly again until they heard about the Flatwoods encounter and realized that they weren't alone, that other people had seen the same impossible things. Then there was the testimony of George and Edith Snowski, a married couple who claimed to have had their own encounter with something otherworldly just one day after the main Flatwoods incident. On the evening of September 13, 1952, George and Edith were driving along Route 4, approximately 20 miles south of Flatwoods, with their 18-month-old baby son sleeping in the back seat. It was a routine drive, the kind they had made dozens of times before, along a quiet rural road with forests on both sides. Without any warning, and for no apparent reason, the engine of their car suddenly cut out. George, assuming it was some kind of mechanical problem, tried to restart the vehicle, but it refused to respond. The car had simply died, and they were now stranded on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. George popped the hood and stepped out of the car to investigate, though he was not particularly mechanically inclined and had no idea what might be wrong. He was peering into the engine compartment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing by the dim light of their flashlight, when suddenly both he and the car were illuminated by an intensely bright light from above. At the same moment, an overwhelming smell of sulfur filled the air, so strong that both George and Edith gagged on the acrid stench. George looked up, trying to see the source of the light, but it was too bright to look at directly, and he had to shield his eyes. And then, stepping out of the darkness and into the circle of light, came a figure. George later described it as having a reptilian quality, with rough textured skin and an overall appearance that was profoundly inhuman. The entity approached the car with what seemed like deliberate curiosity, walking upright like a human, but moving with an alien grace. It came right up to the front of the vehicle and placed its hands or appendages on the hood of the car, leaning forward to peer through the windshield at the terrified couple inside. Edith clutched their baby son, too frightened to scream, while George sat paralyzed with terror, making eye contact with this impossible visitor through the glass. The entity studied them for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or a minute. Its expression, insofar as George could read anything in that alien face, seemed curious rather than hostile, as if it was examining some interesting specimens it had discovered. And then, apparently satisfied with its observation, the entity straightened up, removed its hands from the hood, turned around, and walked calmly back into the darkness from which it had emerged. As it departed, the intense light that had been illuminating the scene faded and disappeared. The overwhelming sulfur smell dissipated, and inexplicably, impossibly, the engine of the Snowski's car roared back to life on its own, without George turning the key, without any mechanical intervention whatsoever. George didn't waste time trying to understand what had just happened. He slammed the hood shut, jumped back into the driver's seat, and drove away from that spot as fast as the car would carry them, not slowing down until they were safely home with the doors locked and the lights on. Like the Harper girls, the Snowskis initially told no one about their experience, fearing ridicule or disbelief. It was only after the Flatwoods story became public that they came forward, adding their testimony to the growing body of evidence that something genuinely strange was happening in Braxton County in the fall of 1952. As with any high-profile paranormal or UFO case, the Flatwoods Monster encounter attracted its share of skeptics and debunkers. People who were determined to prove that the witnesses had not seen anything genuinely anomalous, but had instead misidentified some perfectly ordinary phenomenon. The most prominent and persistent of these skeptical explanations came from Joe Nikel, an investigator with a reputation for debunking paranormal claims, often by attributing them to misidentified owls. Nickel has made something of a specialty of the owl explanation, having proposed it for numerous cryptid and alien encounter cases over the years, including the famous Kelly Hopkinsville incident and even the Mothman sightings. In the case of the Flatwoods Monster, Nickel's theory was that what the witnesses had actually seen was a barn owl perched in a tree, and that the dramatic description of a 10-foot-tall entity with a spade-shaped head and glowing eyes was the result of misperception, exaggeration, and the distorting effects of flashlight beams and shadows. He pointed out that barn owls, when illuminated suddenly by a flashlight, can indeed have glowing eyes due to the tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer in their retinas that enhances night vision. He also noted that the facial disc of a barn owl, particularly when viewed from below and distorted by shadows, could potentially be interpreted as having an unusual shape. The hissing sound, Nickel suggested, was simply the defensive hiss that barn owls make when threatened, a sound that can indeed be quite loud and unsettling if you're not expecting it. But while Nickel's barn owl theory might account for some elements of the encounter, it falls apart when confronted with the totality of the witness testimony and the physical evidence. First and foremost, it completely fails to explain the landed craft that the witnesses saw and described in detail before they ever encountered the entity. The glowing egg-shaped object pulsing with red light and emitting green mist was not part of the owl sighting. It was a separate phenomenon that the witnesses observed first, and it cannot be explained away as a misidentified bird. Secondly, the barn owl theory doesn't account for the toxic green mist that caused genuine physical symptoms in multiple witnesses and the dog. Barn owls do not emit vapor of any kind, and they certainly don't produce chemical substances that cause vomiting, eye irritation, throat swelling, and lasting respiratory problems. Third, the description of the entity includes details that are simply incompatible with an owl, no matter how distorted the perception. Multiple witnesses described the entity as descending smoothly through the air in a controlled gliding motion, its body upright, moving in a way that no owl moves. They described it as being approximately 10 feet tall when it was hovering or hanging in the tree, a dimension that is obviously impossible for any AAL. They described claw-like appendages at the ends of what appeared to be arms, not wings, and they described the beams of light projecting from the eye ports as active illumination, not mere reflection. Perhaps most damningly for the owl theory, the witnesses included Eugene Lemon, a National Guardsman who would have been familiar with the local wildlife, including owls, and Kathleen May, a lifelong West Virginia resident who had certainly seen barn owls before. These were not city folk unfamiliar with rural wildlife. They were people who knew their local animals, and they were all adamant that what they saw was not any kind of bird. Another skeptical argument that has been raised is that the witnesses' descriptions of the entity changed and became more elaborate over time, suggesting that the story grew in the telling and that details were added or exaggerated as the tale was retold for media outlets. It's true that some aspects of the description did vary between different witnesses and different retellings. For instance, early accounts sometimes described the entity as being roughly human height, while later accounts consistently placed it at 10 to 12 feet tall. Some witnesses emphasized the mechanical robot-like qualities of the being, while others described it in more organic terms. But these variations are actually quite typical of eyewitness testimony in any unusual or traumatic event. Human memory is imperfect, especially under conditions of extreme stress and fear. Different witnesses notice different details. People struggle to find words to describe things that are outside their normal experience. The fact that some details varied doesn't necessarily mean the witnesses were lying or that the event didn't happen. It simply means they were human beings trying to process and communicate an experience that was utterly beyond their frame of reference. What the skeptical theories fail to account for is the physical evidence and the broader context of the encounter. They don't explain why multiple people, including children and adults, including a trained National Guardsman, all saw the same impossible things and all experienced the same physical symptoms. They don't explain the landed craft. They don't explain the toxic mist. They don't explain why the family dog, an animal with keen senses and no capacity for imagination or suggestion, reacted with such extreme terror. And most significantly, they don't explain what happened next. The aspects of the Flatwoods case that suggest something much larger and more disturbing was taking place. For many years, the Flatwoods Monster incident remained a fascinating but ultimately unverifiable story. The kind of case that true believers cited as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, while skeptics dismissed it as misidentification and mass hysteria. But decades after the event, information began to emerge that suggested the US government and military had taken the incident far more seriously than they had ever publicly acknowledged, and that there may have been a deliberate effort to suppress evidence and discourage further investigation. The first hint of official interest came from a National Guard officer named Captain Dale Leavitt, who many years later disclosed that he and his men had been deployed to the Flatwoods area in the immediate aftermath of the September 12th encounter. According to Leavitt's account, his unit had been sent to the forest near the Fisher farm to conduct a search and investigation of the site. This was not a casual look around. It was an organized military operation with specific objectives. Leavitt stated that his team had in fact discovered physical evidence at the location, including metallic fragments and oily residue that they collected and carefully packed up. This material was then sent to Washington, D.C. for analysis, presumably by military or government laboratories. And then, according to Leavitt, something very strange happened. The results of that analysis were never shared with his unit. The materials were never returned, and perhaps most tellingly, his team was strongly discouraged from discussing the Flatwoods incident or their involvement in the investigation. It was made clear to them that this was not a matter for public discussion. Leavitt's revelation raises profound questions. If the Flatwoods incident was simply a case of people misidentifying a barn owl, why would the National Guard be deployed to collect evidence? Why would that evidence be sent to Washington for analysis? Why would there be pressure to keep the investigation quiet? The military doesn't typically respond that way to reports of owls in trees. The deployment of military personnel and the collection of physical evidence suggests that someone in a position of authority believed that something genuinely unusual and potentially significant had occurred in those woods, something that warranted serious investigation and possibly containment. But the military connection to the Flatwoods incident goes even deeper and darker. On the same night that the Flatwoods encounter occurred, September 12, 1952, there was a much broader wave of UFO sightings taking place all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Multiple witnesses in multiple states reported seeing unusual aerial objects, including glowing red spheres similar to what the Flatwoods witnesses described. The U.S. military was well aware of these reports, and in fact had implemented increased patrols and defensive measures in response to the wave of sightings. Fighter aircraft were being scrambled to investigate these objects, to identify them, and if necessary, to intercept them. One of these scrambled aircraft was an F-94 Starfire, an all-weather interceptor that had taken off from its base in Tampa, Florida, at approximately the same time that the Flatwoods incident was occurring. The F-94 was crewed by two men, pilot John Jones Jr. and radar operator John Del Curto. Their mission was to patrol a designated area along the East Coast and investigate any unusual radar contacts or visual sightings. Radio communications with the aircraft were normal as it proceeded to its patrol area. And then, suddenly, and without any distress call or warning, the F-94 disappeared from radar screens. It simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next moment it was gone. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, covering hundreds of square miles of ocean and coastal areas. But no trace of the aircraft or its crew was ever found. No wreckage, no debris, no bodies, nothing. It was as if the plane had been plucked out of the sky and erased from existence. And then something even more disturbing happened. In the months and years that followed the disappearance, all official records of the F-94, its mission that night, and its two crew members were quietly removed from United States Air Force documentation. It wasn't just that the case remained unsolved. It was that the case ceased to officially exist. Families of the two missing airmen who attempted to get information about what had happened to their loved ones were stonewalled. Their inquiries were ignored or deflected. It was as if the military wanted to pretend that the aircraft and the two men aboard had never existed in the first place. The timing of this disappearance is impossible to ignore. An F-94 interceptor vanishes from radar at the exact same time that a glowing red object is descending in a controlled manner into the woods of West Virginia. at the exact same time that a wave of UFO sightings is occurring all along the eastern seaboard. Is this merely coincidence? Or is it possible that the F-94 encountered something in the air that night? Something that led to its destruction or disappearance? Something connected to whatever landed in Flatwoods? Some researchers have speculated that the craft that came down in Flatwoods might have been damaged or disabled, possibly by an encounter with military aircraft, and that it landed there for repairs or because it was no longer able to continue its flight. If that were the case, the entity that the witnesses encountered might have been some kind of guardian or automated defense system protecting the craft while it was vulnerable. The evidence of a government cover-up, while circumstantial, is compelling. The deployment of National Guard personnel to collect evidence. The collection of physical materials that were sent to Washington and never heard from again. The pressure on military personnel to remain silent. The disappearance of an interceptor aircraft and the subsequent erasure of all records of that disappearance. The pattern is consistent with other alleged UFO incidents where the military and government appeared to be far more interested and far more concerned than they were willing to admit publicly, where official statements downplayed or dismissed events that internal actions suggested were being taken very seriously indeed. More than 70 years have passed since that September evening in 1952 when a group of ordinary people in a small West Virginia town came face to face with something that should not exist. In the decades since, the Flatwoods Monster has become an indelible part of American folklore. The encounter has been depicted in movies and television shows, analyzed in books and documentaries, and recreated as a character in video games, including the popular Fallout franchise. The small town of Flatwoods has embraced its place in cryptid history, with a museum dedicated to the incident, a large monument featuring a dramatic representation of the entity, and an annual festival that draws thousands of visitors from around the world, all hoping to connect with this famous mystery. But beneath the tourist attractions and the commercialization, beneath the pop culture representations and the merchandise, the fundamental questions raised by the Flatwoods encounter remain unanswered. What did those people really see that night? Was it an extraterrestrial craft and its occupant, visitors from another world who landed briefly in West Virginia for reasons we can only guess at? Was it some kind of experimental military technology that malfunctioned or was being tested in secret, something so classified that the government couldn't acknowledge its existence even when civilians stumbled across it? Was it something else entirely, something that doesn't fit into either the extraterrestrial or the military explanation? Something from another dimension or another reality that occasionally intrudes into our world in ways we don't understand. The skeptics will continue to insist that it was all a misidentification, that the witnesses saw ordinary things and allowed fear and imagination to transform them into something extraordinary. But that explanation requires us to dismiss or ignore too much evidence, too much testimony, too many physical effects, too many corroborating accounts. It requires us to believe that multiple people, including trained observers and lifelong residents familiar with their local environment, all made the same mistakes, all experienced the same delusions, all suffered the same physical symptoms from exposure to nothing more than the night air and their own adrenaline. The truth, whatever it may be, remains elusive. Only those who were there that night, who stood in those woods and looked up at that hovering figure with its glowing red face and its beams of light scanning the darkness, who breathed in that toxic green mist and felt their bodies react with illness and terror, only they can truly know what they experienced. And for them, the memory of the Flatwoods Monster is not a fun story or an entertaining mystery. It is a genuine trauma, a night when the safe and familiar world revealed itself to be far stranger and far more frightening than they had ever imagined possible. The Flatwoods Monster stands as a reminder that despite all our technology and all our scientific knowledge, despite our conviction that we understand the world and our place in it, there are still mysteries that elude explanation. There are still encounters that challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what is real. And there are still questions, so many questions, waiting in the dark woods of West Virginia and in countless other places around this strange world. Questions that may never be answered, but that continue to call to us, daring us to look deeper, to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, we don't know everything after all. The truth is out there, somewhere, hidden in the shadows between what we know and what we fear. And it's waiting, always waiting for the next group of curious souls brave enough or foolish enough to go looking for it.